And hello and welcome back to America's Forum right here on Newsmax TV. I'm John Bachman.
And I'm J.D. Hayworth. Topping the news in this final hour on Friday, Israel launching airstrikes on 3 areas in Gaza. The move comes in response to 5 rockets from Gaza hitting heavily populated areas in southern Israel. The Israeli military says it's the most substantial attack in 2 years against the country. The military wing of Palestinian Islamic Jihad claiming responsibility for those attacks. UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon condemning the attack. A spokesman from the UN says Moon urges restraint from all parties to prevent an escalation of violence. And joining us now to discuss the situation in the Middle East, law professor Alan Dershowitz. Professor Dershowitz, welcome to America's Forum.
Well, thanks. I appreciate it. And, you know, Ban Ki-moon is part of the problem, not part of the solution. When he says he urges restraint on both parts, he imposes a kind of moral equivalence on both sides. And, of course, the last thing Israel wants to have is rocket attacks. Either way, they want peace, whereas Islamic Jihad violates peace treaties and just sends rockets, targets. One of them landed near a library. Another one landed in a populated area. You can't call that moral equivalence. Any democracy, of course, would have to respond to those rocket attacks. The condemnation should be solely directed against those who send the rockets, not those who defend themselves. As President Obama said when he visited Sderot, the area which was attacked before he became president, he said, if rockets were hitting my children's home, I would do everything in my power to stop it, and I expect Israel to do everything in its power to stop those rocket attacks.
Well, Alan, when we take a look at this situation, why now? Why the attacks from Palestinian quarters now? Any ideas?
Yes, I think that these are groups that desperately do not want peace. And usually when you see negotiations ongoing and moving in any way toward the possibility of a resolution, that's when 2 things happen. One, you get more attacks from Gaza, and second, you get more attacks from academics around the world calling for BDS, boycotts, divestment, and sanctions against Israel, because the Islamic Jihad in Gaza and the academics in London and Paris have the same goal. They're both opposed to a 2-state solution. They both want to see the destruction of Israel, and they'll both do anything in their power to prevent the peace process from going forward. So this is directed as much against the Palestinian Authority in many ways as it is against Israel.
So, you know, Alan, we're looking at this as well. Secretary of State John Kerry yesterday said that their insistence is that the Palestinians publicly declare Israel to be a Jewish state. We see Secretary Kerry spread pretty thin, dealing with a bunch of issues here. What is your take on his attempt to keep the peace process ongoing in the region?
Well, I commend him for keeping the peace process ongoing. I think in the end, though, the Palestinians are going to have to bite the bullet and recognize that Israel is, in fact, the nation-state of the Jewish people historically, and that it is a legitimate state for the Jewish people, just like there are, 25 or 30 Muslim states and dozens of Arab states. There should be one state which is historically recognized as the nation-state of the Jewish people. And I spoke to Abbas about that myself, and I think in the end, there's going to have to be some compromise way of stating it in a way that satisfies both Israel and the Palestinians. I hope that doesn't become the major barrier to peace. I think what we need is a 2-state solution with land swaps, which allow the Palestinians to have a viable state, but protect Israel's security. Look, these rockets are coming from Gaza. Imagine if there were a Palestinian state on Israel's border just a few miles away from Ben Gurion Airport, which could send these rockets and destroy Israel's economy by preventing people from landing airplanes in Gaza, or having rockets hit the outskirts of Tel Aviv or the center of Tel Aviv. So Israel has to be very cautious in the territorial concessions it makes for fear that the West Bank could become another Gaza Strip if Hamas or Islamic Jihad were to take over there.
Yeah, and we recently heard Ariel Sharon make that case, Benjamin Netanyahu rather, make that case recently when he visited the White House, very eloquently pointing out to President Obama just how much Israel has done so far in this process.
And Alan, Prime Minister Netanyahu says he's going to keep up the pressure on the militants. What do you expect now from the Israeli government?
Well, I think that every time the Israelis see rockets being fired, they're going to try to preemptively stop those rockets by sending their own artillery and drones, and that's what they should do. That's what America would do. If we had rockets coming from Cuba or from any other place, we would do the same thing. We wouldn't wait until the rockets hit a school bus full of kids or a library full of people. We would take whatever preemptive action is necessary to stop the rockets from being fired, and then there'll be retaliation. The interesting thing is Hamas is not behind this. They would like to have a ceasefire, but Hamas doesn't go far enough in trying to control other groups within its territory, and so Islamic Jihad and other radical groups are defying the orders of Hamas, and that could happen on the West Bank as well. That's why Israel needs some territorial wit to protect itself against these kinds of attacks. And, of course, we saw the other day that the Iranians are sending long-range rockets into Gaza. Israel, fortunately, with the help of the United States, intercepted that shipload of deadly weapons. But if those deadly weapons had reached Gaza, then we would see rockets that could hit the center of Tel Aviv and the center of Jerusalem.
Professor Dershowitz, a recent column that you wrote that appeared at Newsmax.com made the point that Europe is pushing to isolate Israel. Would you encapsulate that column for us? What makes you believe that we're seeing this on the part of the Europeans?
Well, it's not on the part of the European governments. Many of the European governments, particularly the conservative ones, Germany and England, are fully supportive of Israel, though not of its settlement policies, but supportive of Israel's security. But it's academics from the hard left, and it's some individual political figures and radicals who are trying to isolate Israel through the boycott, divestment, sanction movement, artists, people, and Stephen Hawking, who may be, very intelligent when it comes to physics, but he's a moron when it comes to politics. And he decided to forego a trip to Israel and participate in the boycotting of Israel. That is a moronic and immoral stance for Hawking to take, and I would publicly challenge Hawking to debate me on the politics of the DBS campaign, because it's making it much harder to make peace. DBS sends a message to the Palestinians: don't accept a good deal that Kerry offers, because you'll get better, because the DBS people will force and isolate Israel into accepting a much worse deal. So the BDS movement backfires. It's bad for peace, it's bad for democracy, it's bad for morality.
Professor Dershowitz, let's amplify the challenge you just issued. Now, specifically for Stephen Hawking to debate these issues with you in a public forum?
Absolutely. I would fly to England at my own expense to debate him on the immorality of participating in a boycotting of Israel, isolating Israel, not boycotting Cuba, not boycotting China, not boycotting Russia, not boycotting any of the countries that repress and oppress others, but boycotting the only democracy in the Middle East, the democracy with the greatest amount of academic freedom. To pick out that one democracy for a boycott is a bigotry, and reminiscent of the bigotry of the 1930s when the German government called for a boycott on all academics who were Jewish and all artists who were Jewish. And, of course, the idea of boycotting Israel technology, we couldn't be having this conversation if we boycotted Israel technology, because Israel is largely responsible for the development of the cell phone, the development of much agricultural life-saving, medical life-saving technology, the absurdity of trying to boycott the products of a country that has contributed more life-saving technology per capita to the world than any other country, that has saved more Muslim and Arab lives than any other country in the world through its medical technology. The hypocrisy of Stephen Hawking calling for a boycott of that country. The hypocrisy of Oxfam, which actually supports terrorist organizations that are on the list of terrorist groups. For Oxfam disassociating itself with Scarlett Johansson because she is the spokesperson for an Israeli company that is in Malaya Dumim and employs hundreds of Palestinian workers. It's unbelievable, the hypocrisy we're hearing from Europe.
Well, Professor Dershowitz, we have to leave it there, but we would welcome the chance to host that debate right here on Newsmax TV, and we look forward to our next conversation with you.
Well, you have my agreement.
And maybe we can get Scarlett Johansson to come too as well. That would be fun.
Sure.
Thanks very much, Professor Alan Dershowitz. There's more ahead as America's Forum continues here on Newsmax TV.